The night was bitter, the kind of night where the cold feels alive, creeping into bones, biting at skin, and reminding every soul on the street that warmth is a luxury. Boston's sidewalks were almost deserted, the city lights reflecting against patches of ice left from the earlier snow. Daniel Carter drove slowly, his windshield wipers pushing away thin flakes falling lazily from the sky. At 38, he had grown used to late nights in his profession as an architect. Drafts, revisions, endless client calls. It had all become routine. But as tired as he was, Daniel loved the quiet of the drive home, where his thoughts could breathe. That's when he saw her. At first it looked like trash left behind, a glittery bundle near the lamppost. But when the headlights swept across, Daniel's heart jolted. It wasn't trash. It was a woman. She was curled up on the frozen ground, her body trembling violently. Her outfit, a sequined bar dancer's costume, sparkled faintly, but it did nothing against the cold. Her lips were blue, and her arms hugged her knees like a shield. Daniel slowed, debating what to do. He was cautious by nature, not someone who invited trouble, but something about the fragility of the figure on the road made him stop. He rolled down the window. "Hey!" His voice cut into the silence. "Are you okay?" The woman startled, lifting her head. Mascara streaked down her face, her eyes swollen and tired. Her breath came out in visible clouds, weak and shaky. For a moment she said nothing, then whispered, I have nowhere to go." Daniel hesitated. His mind reminded him of the risks. She could be dangerous. She could be lying, maybe even baiting him for something worse. But his heart saw her broken heels, her bare arms, and the sheer desperation in her eyes. "Get in," he said firmly, unlocking the passenger door. She hesitated. The look in her eyes wasn't relief, it was suspicion, as if every time someone offered her help, there had always been a hidden price. But the freezing wind gusted hard, and finally she slid into the seat, hugging herself tighter. Daniel turned up the heater. Silence filled the car for several moments before he asked, "What's your name?" "You dig, Clara," she whispered. Her voice was soft, trembling not only from the cold but from something deeper. They drove in silence, the hum of the car filling the gap between them. Daniel studied her from the corner of his eye. She was young, mid-20s at most. The sequined dress looked torn on one side, her makeup smeared. She wasn't drunk, at least not visibly, but she was broken. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice almost lost against the sound of the heater. "You don't have to do this. You can just drop me anywhere. I'm used to it." Daniel frowned. "Used to what?" "Being left on the side of the road." She gave a bitter laugh, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Men are kind until they've had enough. Then they throw you out like garbage." Daniel gripped the wheel tighter. He wasn't a man given to impulsive emotions, but her words stirred something in him. "Well, I'm not them," he said quietly. He drove her to a nearby diner that stayed open all night. Clara didn't argue when he led her inside, though she seemed embarrassed by her clothes under the bright lights. The waitress eyed them suspiciously, but Daniel ignored it. "Order anything," he told Clara. She shook her head. "I don't need pity." "It's not pity," Daniel said firmly. "It's dinner and it's warm. Just eat." Slowly, Clara relented, her shaking fingers wrapping around the coffee mug when it arrived. She sipped carefully, as though she hadn't tasted something warm in days. Daniel studied her again. There was something about her eyes, beyond the smudged makeup, beyond the weariness, that struck him. They weren't the eyes of someone weak. They were the eyes of someone who had fought too many battles alone. Finally, Daniel asked gently, "Why were you out there?" Clara hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, she whispered, "Because I had to run. If I stayed, I wouldn't be alive right now." Daniel froze. Her words weren't casual. They carried weight. "What do you mean?" he pressed softly. Clara looked around the diner as if afraid someone might overhear. Then she leaned closer. "The club where I worked, it wasn't just dancing. They owned us. They controlled everything. And tonight one of the owners lost his temper. I talked back. He hit me." Her fingers trembled as she touched the faint bruise forming on her cheekbone. I ran before they could do more, but I have no money, no family here, no one to turn to. Daniel's chest tightened. He didn't know this woman, and yet every word she spoke dug into him. He thought of his own younger sister, who had passed years ago from an illness. If she were alive and in this girl's place, wouldn't he want anyone to help her? "Clara," he said carefully, "you're safe now, I promise." She laughed bitterly again. Safe? No one's ever safe when men like them want you back. Daniel didn't know then that her words were true, that the night he found Clara was only the beginning of something much bigger. The days that followed were strange. Against his better judgment, Daniel let Clara stay in the guest room of his apartment. She protested at first, insisting she didn't want charity, but exhaustion won. She slept for almost 2 days straight. When she finally emerged, wearing clothes Daniel's sister had left behind years ago, she looked different, less like a bar dancer, more like a frightened young woman trying to remember who she was. Daniel tried not to pry, but pieces of her story came out over time. She'd grown up in foster care, bouncing from one home to another until she aged out. With no family, no money, and no degree, she had fallen into the first job that offered cash, dancing. At first it seemed harmless, but soon it became a trap. The club wasn't just a bar, it was a cage, and Clara was one of many trapped inside. Daniel listened, and with every story she told he grew angrier, not at her but at the world that had failed her. But Clara wasn't just a victim. Slowly, Daniel saw her resilience. She had scars, yes, but she had fire too. She talked about how she once dreamed of being a nurse, of helping people. Her voice softened when she spoke of it, as though remembering a part of herself long buried. One evening, as they sat eating takeout, Daniel said, "Why don't you try again?" Clara looked at him puzzled. "Try what?" "Your dream, nursing. You're young, Clara. It's not too late." She laughed, shaking her head. "Dreams are for people who don't have to fight to survive. People like you." Daniel leaned forward. "No. Dreams are for people who are brave enough to start over. That's you, Clara. You've already survived the worst." Her eyes softened. For the first time since he'd met her, Daniel saw a flicker of hope. But life rarely changes without resistance. One night, as Daniel returned from work, he noticed a black car parked near his apartment building. Its tinted windows hid its occupants, but the sight left a chill in his stomach. Clara confirmed his fear when he asked. "They found me," she whispered, trembling. "They'll never let me go." Daniel wasn't a man of violence. He was an architect, not a fighter, but something inside him hardened. Clara wasn't going back, not if he could help it. The next days were a blur of lawyers, police reports, and tense conversations. Clara was terrified to testify, but Daniel stood by her side through it all. Together, they built a case, uncovering not just her abuse, but a ring of exploitation that had trapped dozens of women. It wasn't easy. There were threats, nights when Clara woke screaming from nightmares, days when Daniel doubted they'd win. But slowly, justice moved. The bar owners were investigated, arrested, exposed, and Clara was free. Months later, Clara stood in front of a classroom, books in hand, her hair tied back neatly. She had enrolled in a nursing program with Daniel's encouragement. The girl who once shivered on the roadside now carried herself with quiet determination. Daniel often thought back to that night, the freezing road, the fragile figure under the lamppost. If he had driven past, she might not have survived. But he had stopped. He had listened. And that single act of kindness had changed not only Clara's life, but his own. Because in saving her, Daniel discovered something too, that compassion, the simplest form of humanity, has the power to rebuild what the world tries to break. And Clara, she discovered that her worth was never tied to a stage, a costume, or the cruelty of others. She was more, she always had been. She just needed someone to remind her. The story of Daniel and Clara spread quietly in their community, inspiring others. Not as a tale of a man rescuing a woman, but as a reminder, sometimes the smallest decision, to stop, to listen, To care can change everything. And on nights when the snow fell, Daniel would glance at the lamppost near his street and remember the woman he almost drove past. The woman who taught him that kindness is never wasted. Clara never forgot either. Every patient she helped in her nursing career carried a piece of that night, the night a stranger's compassion gave her back her life. Sometimes the coldest nights bring the warmest beginnings, and sometimes helping a stranger isn't just saving their life, it's saving your own.